Well, now you're going to hear the true story. This talk is going to be a career story, and the career is going to be mine. The thing is, though, it won't be distressingly personal. Rather will it mark a path through various groves of academe, which I hope will be of general interest. Right, now that path begins with my appointment a very long time ago to the post of lecturer in modern Chinese at SOAS, the London School of Oriental and African Studies.
It seems the mic is not working too well.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
It's a booming to me. I don't know if...
Is it better now?
Yes. Is it better now? Okay,
yes.
Sorry about that. But anyway, we'll assume that we have already started. The name of SOAS, or more exactly the college's previous name of School of Oriental Studies without the African, resounds in the history of modern Chinese literature as a place where Lao She launched his career as a novelist. If he had not been wafted to London from Peking by a lady missionary employed at SOS, he would probably have remained a lowly Manchu school teacher, and neither rickshaw boys nor tea houses would ever have been given a good write-up. Less to the credit of SOS, it was alleged after Lao She's death in articles published in the Mingbao Yuekan here that he received a mere pittance of a salary and was treated more or less like a slave labourer, both on account of being Chinese. While it's surely true that slighting of Orientals was common in British society at that time, it's quite untrue that Lao She was unfairly treated at SOS. College archives show that Mr. Shu, as he was known there, was paid the regular salary for his post as lecturer in Chinese, which was a comfortable living wage. And timetables also show that he shared teaching duties equally with his British colleagues. I wasn't aware of these allegations until much later, but when I was, I wrote an article to set the record straight. For those interested, it was published in the Xianggang Wenxue magazine, September 2003, and the title was Lao She, Qiong Er Hou Gong Ma. You may not know that while he was at SOAS, Lao She recorded the first Linguaphone course in Mandarin Chinese, and also helped Clement Egerton translate the Jinping Mei, the complete text of the Jinping Mei. The indecent passages were done into Latin, so as to protect the less highly educated. Having got Lao She out of the way, I can jump from SOS in the 1920s to SOAS in the 1960s, which is when I got to know it. By that time, the generation of former missionaries, functionaries, and explorers who had previously been the mainstay of the staff had been supplanted by men who had been trained in the wartime intelligence services, and that particularly applied to the Far East Department in connection with the war against Japan. And quite a galaxy of talent had assembled at SOAS in the post-war years. Some had already flown the nest by 1962, which is when I turned up. Cyril Birch had gone to Berkeley, Harry Simon to Melbourne, and Pat Hannon was packing up to go to Stanford, from where he progressed to Harvard. So that place left in place no one active in the modern field, but two outstanding sinologists in the classical field, namely D.C. Lau and Angus Graham, different in their pursuits, but evenly matched in the quality of their scholarship. To take Lau first, Lau's Penguin Classics translations of the Luanyu, Mengzi, and Laozi command such authority that they seem to have been always there. But in fact, Laozi was published in 1963, Mengzi in 1970, and Luanyu not until 1979, which shows that each one was a long time coming and possibly a long time honing and polishing. What strikes one about those canonical translations of Lao's is their cleanness and spareness. He never uses a long word where a short word will do. In that regard, he may have been influenced by having studied for his MA degree in Glasgow, given the Scottish devotion to economy. Lau is very well known here at CUHK, having moved back to head the Chinese department in 1978. So I needn't go into his research output. Though in general you could say that his scholarship was angled towards the so-called reordering the national heritage, generally Guogu. Angus Graham, in contrast, was much more attractive to the offbeat. Graham read theology at Oxford before being conscripted to learn Japanese for wartime purposes. And it might have been theology's call to think the unthinkable that later emboldened him to explore the deepest thickets of ancient Chinese thought and logic. Those were impressive exercises in sheer brain power. Less appreciated has been Graham's skill with words. His Poems of the Late Tang, also a Penguin classic, gives clear examples of that. But his translations of Chinese prose writing prove his verbal powers even more. To show what I mean, I can quote a passage to which I was led, funnily enough, by Lu Xun. Lu Xun once blamed Zhuangzi for encouraging him to write with too much passion in his Darwin. So I went hunting for an impassioned passage in Zhuangzi and found one in the Zaiyou chapter, where Zhuangzi is raging against the rival schools. Here is Graham's translation. In the present age, the condemned to death lie back to back. The shackled in cangs and stocks are elbow to elbow. There's always a mutilated man somewhere in sight. Yet it is just now that Confucius and the Moors start putting on airs and come flipping back their sleeves among the fettered and manacled. Alas, it passes belief. Their impudence and shamelessness passes belief. I'm inclined to think that sagehood and knowledge are the wedges of the stocks and the kang, that goodwill and duty are the pin and hole of fetters and manacles. End of quotation. It's not only impossible to beat that translation, it's impossible even to rival it. So with Lau and Graham and Dennis Twitchell as professor, some serious sinology was going on at SOAS. So what was to be my contribution in the lowly outpost of modern literature? The first thing was to find my way to a PhD. The facilities for research in those days were very different from what you have now. Library holdings left big gaps in materials, very few complete works for modern authors had been published, and biographical information was very fragmentary. To make matters worse, my chosen author was persona non grata in both the mainland and Taiwan on account of his being a collaborator with the Japanese. I refer to Joe Zoran. In fact, he turned out to have been not a bad choice after all. When, by and by, I got to understand his Chinese, he improved my education by leaps and bounds. Having written very knowledgeably about so many different things, both Chinese and foreign. It was he, for instance, who introduced me to Havelock Ellis, author of The Psychology of Sex, published in 7 volumes from 1897 to 1928. No, I didn't finish all 7 volumes. I had to buy Joe Zoran's books second-hand by post from Hong Kong booksellers, mostly dog-eared copies, some with genuine wormholes. But that was a positive thing. Handling those old tattered volumes made the age in which they were written more present and more real to me. Actually, I've still got those books. They rest on my shelves, accumulating more wormholes. My research really got off the ground with study leave. The term study leave may sound unfamiliar or even quaint. At SOAS it was preferred to sabbatical because of the special nature of that institution. In many cases, SOAS had the only posts in the UK tagged to certain regions of the world. And the specialists who occupied those posts were supposed to need a year-long stay every so often in order to keep abreast of developments in their territory. Not only were your fares paid, you even got a tropical or subtropical clothing allowance, so at least you were able to keep up appearances. When my study leave came due in 1966, I went off to Taiwan for the academic year. By then I decided to base my PhD thesis on how Joe Zoran's views on literature fitted in with the Chinese tradition. And Taiwan was the best place for tradition, then as now, besides being the only Mandarin-speaking place I could go to. At that time, the universities in Taiwan were dominated by refugee professors from the mainland. I was adopted by a group of very distinguished, hard-drinking over 60s and was invited to their dinners where the best quality gaoliang flowed freely. I refer to Jinmen Da Chu. I'm afraid that hard drinking has gone out of fashion in academic circles. But later on, I had cause to be grateful for this apprenticeship served in Taiwan, when I was included in a delegation of young British sinologists to the People's Republic of China. Everywhere our delegation went, it was hosted by the local revolutionary committee, the Gaming Weiyuanhui, whose only interest was in trying to drink us under the table at their banquets. But thanks to my close acquaintance with Jinmen Da Chu, Mao-Tai posed no threat on those occasions. I did meet one person of international renown during that year in Taiwan, and that was Lin Yu Tang, also known as Lin Yu Tang. He invited me to his villa on the slopes of Yangmingshan, and like the true gentleman he was, he offered me tea beside his swimming pool. 相公候我. But looking back now, that interview could have gone into my CV. But at that time, I didn't have a CV. Anyway, 4 years later, the harvest had been gathered in, and I submitted my PhD thesis. And this is where the shortage of material I've mentioned proved a blessing. My examiners couldn't find copies of most of the texts that I'd collected, so couldn't check if my sources were correctly translated or properly understood. So I more or less sailed through that examination. I shudder to think how I would have fared if today's resources had been available. Besides Zhou Zuoren's complete works, there are his diaries, his Nianpu, Ji Wai Wen, and numerous books about him. I would have needed more years to go through all that, and been old before my time. When my thesis was published as a book, the only review that I recall, actually there are very few reviews, was by an American professor of English who dabbled in things Chinese. And he complained that my English was impenetrable. Can't be told. Having been safely doctored and with a contract to retirement, terminable only on grounds of so-called gross moral turpitude, which is something comparable to the Chinese Da Li Bu Dao, my personal story can be set aside while we look at the broad picture of the state of international research on modern Chinese literature in the 1960s. Collectively speaking, the Russians and East Europeans had been first off the mark. The work of the Soviet sinologists was largely unknown to us in the democratic West because of the language barrier. After all, it was enough to learn Chinese, let alone Russian. In Prague, though, Yaroslav Prusek led a band of disciples who published in English, French and German. As they belonged to the Eastern Bloc, they had the advantage of being able to go to China to interview authors. Prusek himself, by virtue of his extensive knowledge of Chinese literary history, backed by a formidable intellect, was a force to be reckoned with. And when he responded to C.T. Xiao's History of Modern Chinese Fiction, published in 1961, with a 35-page review or rebuttal, the sparks really flew. Essentially, this was a debate between Prusek and Xiao that turned on a clash of mindsets. Xiao taking the Olympian viewpoint of regarding a work of literature as an artifact to be judged by universal standards, while Prusek regarded a work as a product of the social dynamics of time and place, and therefore being capable of being judged as progressive or regressive. For such small fry as I was, this was a battle of giants. And 50 years on, the battleground is still worth visiting. C.T. Xiao he reprinted the text in a revised version of his history. But sadly, the light of the Prague school was extinguished in the Soviet suppression of the Prague Spring. Most of you are probably too young to remember that. In 1968, Prusek being considered dangerously liberal. C.T. Xiao's 1961 history, just mentioned, could account for the most prominent Chinese novelists, which is fine, who wanted to get an evaluation of those same authors. Those who wanted to know what else was out there and that might possibly be interesting, there was another help at hand. A veritable who's who and what's what in modern Chinese literature. It was a big book with entries in English but names in Chinese characters called 1500 Modern Chinese Novels and Plays. And it was edited by a Catholic priest named Joseph Shins, S-H-Y-N-S. I can't pronounce that name, but somebody in the audience might help. I think only Danish people, or Dutch people rather, can pronounce that surname. I'll repeat the spelling, S-H-Y-N-S. Published in Peking in 1948. 1948. Besides its entries for each published work, 1,500 of them, it also had general surveys and short biographies for 200 authors. Inevitably, some biographical data was guesswork. For instance, it was said that Lao She went to England to study education at Oxford University, though that was a mistake that Lao She himself would probably not have hurried to correct. This handbook, shall we call it, was designed to be a Catholic index, that is, a doctrinal guide to what could or could not be read by the faithful. Its scope had obviously been expanded to cater for literary interest too, probably by Chinese academics involved in the project. To cheer one up as one plowed through these 1,500 entries, one occasionally came across some really engaging verdicts on the individual works. For example, concerning the novels by or attributed to Zhang Henshui. On one, the verdict is a dull book, may be read by everyone. On another, titled Hu Ben Wan Sui, which is about the War of Resistance, it said, epic of a Chinese regiment who killed 20,000 Japanese, for everyone. Zhang's collection of short stories called Jui Pursuit is summed up most intriguingly. This book contains a number of risky allusions and a great number of platitudes, not to be recommended to anyone. But I don't mean to disparage. It was from this book and nowhere else that I learned of the existence of a playwright named Li Jianwu, who wrote better plays than Cao Yu or Tian Han or any of that lot. I found him so interesting that I actually wrote an article on him, which few people have discovered. 40 years later, a much more reliably informed and better balanced survey succeeded this manual, published in 1988 in 4 volumes, according to genre, under the not very attractive title Selective Guide to Chinese Literature 1900 to 1949. This was a project funded by the European Science Foundation under pressure from Joran Malmquist. Almost all of the entries were contributed by European scholars, and 2 of the volumes, I'm pleased to say, were edited by survivors of the Prague School, namely Zbigniew Ślubski and Milena Dolizelova. You could say that this project showed that the study of modern Chinese literature in Europe had attained a critical mass. The turning point had come a decade or so earlier in the USA. Following on books like T.A. Shah's The Gate of Darkness, 1968, and Leo Lee's Romantic Generation, 1973. It's all right. 我已经开了，已经打开了。The conference that Merle Goldman organized in 1974 sealed a spirit of common endeavor in the United States. And of course that conference resulted in the book Chinese Literature in the May 4th Era, a true landmark. So having noted this coming of age of research into modern Chinese literature, I can turn my attention to translation as it impinged on me. Excuse me while I just wet my whistle. I can claim the distinction of being among the first subscribers to Renditions, which was launched in autumn 1973. But that didn't imply conversion. I simply responded to a subscription offer that promised a very good bargain. £5 for 3 years issues. And a good bargain it proved. It allowed sampling with the least expensive effort of a wide range of Chinese literature to which I hadn't been exposed. Apart from introducing Yan Fu and his Xindaya, in the first issue the magazine rightly did not concern itself much with translation theory. And as I didn't bother with translation theory on my own behalf, when many years later C. K. offered me the job of Professor of Translation out of the blue, I was quite unprepared. To be a professor unequipped to profess was not the most comfortable of situations. As it turned out, I needn't have worried. When I joined in 1989, the translation department only ran a minor undergraduate program and a part-time MA. The major in translation didn't come along till 1994, is that right? Good, thank you. The teaching of translation generally in Hong Kong was heavily weighted towards practical purposes. Hence, Peter Newmark's books, J.C. Catford's A Linguistic Theory of Translation, headed the reading lists, with Eugene Nider in reserve for inspiration with his dynamic translation. All the while, though, a steady stream of good books of more cultural interest was underway. Susan Basnett's 1980 translation studies had provided a valuable oversight, and there followed playing their own tunes Gideon Turi, Andre Lefebvre, Theo Hermans, Mona Baker, Lawrence Venuti, Kai Dorot, and others besides. So there was satisfaction that one had entered a credible and creditable academic field, not a mere spin-off of other disciplines, with which went an incentive to make a contribution oneself. More of that later. The more pleasurable aspect of my employment was the hands-on work of co-editor with Eva Hong of Renditions. I suppose the chief source of pleasure was that of being able to make things happen, both by giving safe passage to capable contributions and by putting wind in the sails of those that needed it. The editorial team of Eva Hong, Georgia Yu, Janice Wickery, Eva Hong, and myself were between us able to cover the waterfront, as they say, to detect errors in interpretation and to propose improvements in wording. In that way, quite a number of apprentice pieces were able to see the light of day. More positive and enterprising, even challenging, was the preparation of special issues. These had begun under Stephen Song and George Gao, the first being the special art issue in 1976. Over the years, a very wide range of topics was covered, from contemporary literature in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the mainland, back down through the ages to classical antiquity. And it speaks well for Renditions' reputation that the biggest guns in Chinese English translation responded to requests to contribute to the special issues. And of course the special issue is continuing today. If you want to make things happen, it helps to have money to spend. Eva had built up a sizable fund for research centre purposes, and with that she was able to invite most of the aforementioned professors of Chinese studies, as well as authors who are producing the literature being translated, including the future Nobel Prize winner, Mo Yan, who we heard a lot about recently, as well as the doyens of Chinese English translations like Yang Cheney and Gladys Yang, Burton Watson and Cyril Birch. The cultural life of the university as a whole was immeasurably enriched by their lectures. Happy days. So to turn from overseeing translation, how are we doing? I suppose time is dribbling on, isn't it? Never mind, I'll just... To turn from overseeing translation to investigating translation, a very good subject was on our doorstep. The standard history of 19th century has made us all familiar with the translation bureaus set up by the Qing government to import Western learning for practical purposes, following the footsteps of Japan. Little attention had been given to activities in civil society to import Western literature. So a plan was born. A concerted attempt could be made to do the following. A, take stock of the whole extent of literature translated at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. B, study the correspondence or disparity between source text and translated text. C, to consider what of significance could be deduced therefrom, and D, to assess the impact on the host culture in terms of creative writing. A big job, and put that way, one perfectly designed to attract a research grant, which indeed it did, from the RGC. This was about 1994. With the money, we were able to buy source materials and pay for a research assistant to comb through periodicals in Peking libraries for comments on translation, among other things. We had a core group of participants here in Hong Kong and went on to secure the help of scholars from the mainland, Japan and USA to round out the picture. I don't see why they should remain anonymous, so I'll just run through their names. Terumuto Teruo, David Wang is Wang Dewei, Xiong Yuezhi, Chen Pingyuan, Xia Xiaohong, Wang Xiaoming, and Yuan Jing. Our research assistant was Liu Shuseng. They all seem to have done reasonably well for themselves subsequently. As to the phenomenon we were dealing with, the swamping of Chinese periodicals with translations of foreign literature, the volume itself was very impressive. In one 5-year span, more translated works were published than original works. And a fascinating assortment of people were doing the translating. At one end of the scale, of course, was the celebrated Guwen stylist Lin Shu, followed by reformist intellectuals like Liang Qiqiao. At the other end were struggling students in Japan like Lu Xun and Zhou Zhuo. And in the middle were popular authors like Bao Tianxiao and Zhou Guisheng. The Chinese versions appeared in the modes of classical Chinese, literary Chinese, old storyteller Baihua, and modern Baihua. One translator of 1905 even chose the medium of Peking colloquial, making it so authentic that she thought it wise to supply a vocabulary for our non-Peking readers. The only form missed out was parallel prose, biannual. A similarly wide range of liberties was taken with the source texts, in the main to express the author's own ideas, the so-called heroic translation, but also to conform to Chinese conventions. For instance, how friends should behave towards each other, and what a pretty lady should look like. Certainly not robust and tanned. In the search for fiction to translate, there was a good deal of haphazardness, but strong trends were obvious too. Tales of dauntless adventurers, explorers, scientists come bold men of action like the Jules Verne heroes, not to mention the fearless forensic crime solver Sherlock Holmes, were seized upon, probably because they reflected the perceived lack of such types among the Chinese population of the time. The only poet translated was Byron, on account of his having died a heroic death on the battlefield in Greece. In the case of translation and creation, which was the name given to this project, the idea came first and the funds followed. Unusually, in the case of the Encyclopedia of Translation, published by the Chinese University Press, the funds came first and the idea followed. A pot of gold had been buried for years in the translation department. Donations from Hong Kong firms with no strings attached. So here was a case of 此地有银300两. The plan for an encyclopedia was proposed by none other than Chen Jiawei, who already had a database on the go. Most teachers in Hong Kong, most teachers of translations in Hong Kong, past and present, contributed, as did scholars from the mainland, and many of the leading lights in the West. The book is widely known and used in Hong Kong, so I don't need to go on about it. So, next chapter. So far I haven't mentioned renditions books. There's now a long shelf full of these, paperbacks and hardbacks. Most titles are translations of works of living authors. Some revisit the past to cater for an established interest. But my contribution to the series originated in a private interest, since I had embarked on sinology with an essayist. Loyalty to the brand led me to produce a book of translations of Chinese essays, ancient and modern, which I immodestly titled The Chinese Essay. Translations of famous classical essays had been published in anthologies, of course, but there had been no dedicated volume covering both ancient and modern prose since Herbert Giles's Gems of Chinese Literature, first published in 1883 and expanded in 1922. So there was a gap to be filled, as well as a cause to be served, very possibly a lost cause. In Giles's day, the essay form was very popular in Europe and America, but in more recent times it has suffered from neglect. But never mind, popular or not, there's a lot to be said for the essay. The main alternative vehicles for leisure reading are fiction and poetry. Fiction is imagined, and poetry is bound up with images and metre, whereas an essay affords direct, unmediated contact with the author, person to person, a voice out of the void. And that voice may be many things: amusing, instructive, heartening, and all things bright and beautiful, or not, as the case may be. As with other genres, you have to strike lucky. 2/3 of the pieces I translated were modern, and having been written after the introduction of the Western essay to China, were recognizable as essays. The classical prose compositions had to be taken on their own terms. All too often, the aim of traditional Wenjiang was to impress readers with the writer's literary skills or cleverness, and one didn't want those. But it wasn't all that difficult to find other kinds: vivid pen portraits, affective reminiscences, crafty satires, comic bombast, and so on. All those types, and more besides, could make for a good read, which I hope they did. Now, with anthologies, with one author, where one author is representing a diversity of authors. One translator. I misspoke on this book. One translator is representing a diversity of authors. Unkind critics are hoping to remark that all these different authors are made to sound alike. Actually, it is understandable why that might be so. After all, an individual's linguistic flexibility is limited, and it doesn't do to transgress against the usages of one's own time. But sometimes a uniformity of translation style can be deliberate. A heightened register of language may be adopted for belles lettres, and that seems to have been the rule in Herbert Giles's day. I'll give you just two examples, both from Ouyang Xiu's 追文听记. First example, in reference to what the prefect arranges for his friends on their picnic, there's an expression, 山摇野宿, a set phrase which I translated as local game and wild greens. As Giles had, a few such dishes of meats and fruits as the hills are able to provide. So my translation was minimal, and Giles was expanded quite fulsomely. Second phrase, on the changes brought about by the seasons. In winter we have 水落而失诸者. In my version, the rocks emerging as the waters recede. Giles's version, the naked boulders of the lessening torrent. So my diction was plain, following the original. Giles's diction, highly poetical. But over and above the diction or choice of words, you can hear how Giles instinctively picks up a metrical rhythm. In the first case, an iambic meter with stress on the second of two syllables. A few such dishes of meats and fruits as the hills are able to provide. Very clear. In the second example is a trochaic meter with stresses on the first of two syllables. The naked boulders of the lessening torrent. Now, later generations just can't match those orotund tones, those rhetorical heights, those rolling periods. If we cannot or will not imitate, we can still admire, which I do. Right, next chapter. The pendulum swung back with the book, The True Story of Lu Xun, which was 100% research and only 10% translation. The fact that it was a short book and had no annotation, as some of you may have discovered, wasn't altogether my fault. In fact, I never intended to write the book at all. To backtrack, my involvement with Lu Xun started in earnest when I wrote a paper on the Zarwan for Leo Li's book, Lu Xun and His Legacy, 1981. I later kept my hand in by writing an occasional article for the periodical Lu Xun Yanjiu Yue Kan, egged on by Wanda Ho of the Lu Xun Museum in Peking, who had become a friend. Not many people knew of that sideline because first, the articles were written in Chinese, and second, only my Chinese name was listed in the table of contents, followed by Ying in brackets, Ying for England, or English. This Ying was important because a foreigner was given liberties not freely allowed to Chinese scholars. The reason being that a foreigner's mistaken views were laughable, not culpable. I had the most fun arguing that the brassy, loud-mouthed, bean-curd beauty, the Doufu Shishi, was the only positive character in the story Gu Xiang, not excluding the author's alter ego, who's called Xun Ge in the story. So, when I was approached to write a short book on Lu Xun for a series designed for American college students, I was willing. Such books had, I assumed, guaranteed sales. Excuse me, I'm a little moist again. Right. The series was to be published by a big New York house, and I was paid $100 US as a signing on fee and assigned a project editor. Eventually I fell out with this editor because she wanted me to follow the advice of her own tame sinological expert, which was misguided. So I withdrew from the project, painful though the return of the $100 was. Mission aborted then, but the seed had been sown for a compact, no-frills biography of Lu Xun. We're talking about the end of the 20th century now, by which time Chinese researchers had ceased to be obliged to only sing Lu Xun's praises and were allowed to shed light on his private life. So it had become possible to portray, although briefly, a believable person. By the way, the 10% translation was that of the 1933 essay called 为了忘却的纪念, to remember in order to forget. I included it because it allowed Lu Xun to speak for himself, which he did more effectively than I could on his behalf. And when the publisher needed to be found, the Chinese University Press obliged, generously tolerating the continued absence of footnotes. Right, last verse, I think. Real life in China. Despite being well and truly retired, I have a new book currently in the published works already mentioned on my right. Translations take up most of the space, but as the content of the original is peculiar, quite a lot of commentary is also needed, and quite a lot of digging to supply that commentary. And the subject matter is Ji Yun or Ji Xiaolan's collection of sketches and anecdotes, mostly concerned with the supernatural, called Yue Wei Cao Tang Biji, published at the end of the 18th century. I had no thought of even reading this collection until I saw the Sanmin Shuju edition on the shelves of the commercial bookstores bookstore in Shatin, with its attractive bright blue cover. When I opened the pages, I saw that the text was heavily annotated and had Bible translations to boot, so I could grope my way to understanding what it said. Ji Xiaolan's declared aim in publishing these tales towards the end of his life was a moral one, to warn his readers that they won't get away with doing bad things because the gods are always watching at their elbow. It is true that a fair number of the 1,200 items in that Yue Wei Cao Tang are simple yin guo bao yin tales. As you sow, so shall you reap. But there are plenty that go far beyond that scope. Some have purely mundane settings, telling of people subjected to hardships and ordeals. Fox spirits do duty to comment on social values. Jiggery-pokery in the underworld mirrors what goes on in the this world, and so on. The Wild West of China, whither Ji was exiled for 2 years in mid-Korea, gets a good showing too. There are even straightforward disquisitions on big topics or scholarly topics, like the relative merits of the three teachings, the Sanjiao. So a very mixed bag to choose from. Extremely varied too are the sources of the entries, for only a small minority are from Ji Xiaolan himself. The great majority are contributed by named individuals, each one Ji Xiaolan claims being faithfully and impartially recorded. And the contributors range from one end of the social spectrum to the other, from family servants, wet nurses and tenant farmers at one end, to the highest scholars and officials in the empire at the other end. Each of the items gives glimpses of the contemporary world as perceived by these diverse individuals. Each supernatural happening is embedded in a familiar context, and every milieu you can think of is represented. So unintentionally, the author has assembled a jigsaw picture of his place and time, and that is how I eventually decided to present my book, giving it the hopefully intriguing title, Real Life in China and the Han Empire Revealed by the Ghosts of Ji Xiaolan. I plan to make this book reader-friendly, as far as possible making the tales as approachable as the originals were to Ji's contemporaries. He had no clutter of footnotes, so I should not either. He could be confident that his readers could cope with the language he used, so I should monitor my English to keep it penetrable. Naturally, I had to supply a lot of background information to my readers that he had no need to, but all that could be done in parallel to the stories, non-invasively, and we should see how that turns out. Conclusion. In conclusion, I come back to renditions and end on a high note. I recall at the top of the page mission statement for translation, which ran, "The purpose of translation is to dissolve national frontiers by removing language barriers and by giving access to the cultural riches of other nations to upgrade citizens of one country to become citizens of the world." In other words, this mission is to civilize. End of quote. That does tie in with the renditions enterprise, in that the founding fathers were true citizens of the world, and as their own lives had been enriched by Western culture, so they wished to share the best of Chinese culture with the rest of humanity. Ultimately, what sustains individual translators in their endeavours is that same thought, that they have in their hands something they should share with others. In the case of Yue Wei Cao Tang Bi Ji, its pages were densely populated by ghosts, the dead whom Ji Xiaolan does not let lie down. It was his job to parade them before his readers. My job was to bring him, the author, back to life. Let his voice be heard again, though speaking a language he would never have thought himself capable of speaking. And not only his voice, but those of the crowd of contributors to his collection. It was a picturesque world they created for themselves. One can't help feeling a little bit envious. 完了。